The morning smoke was already rising from every chimney in the valley, sharp and bitter in the air, when the shouting started again near the river bend. Not angry shouting, just the kind that came easy to men standing around with cold hands and nothing better to do than laugh at somebody else's idea of work. They called her the lazy widow, though that wasn't her name, and most of them didn't even know her real one. All they knew was that she didn't come to church anymore, didn't ask for help after the freeze took her husband last year, and that she spent too much time near the river, building something that looked like a broken wagon wheel slapped crooked on a post. This morning the wheel was spinning slow and jerky in the winter flow, creaking like it wanted to stop. Two ranch hands, Ed Bickley and Jonah Ricks, stood beside their sleigh, horses steaming, watching it turn with smirks on their wind-chapped faces. "She thinks that's gonna heat a cabin," Bickley scoffed. "Might as well knit a sweater out of river slime. She should have remarried like a sane woman," Ricks muttered. "Instead she's out here building furniture for the fish." They laughed again, loud enough to echo off the snowy banks. But the widow didn't look at them. She was adjusting the makeshift sluice box, sleeves soaked up to the elbow, half of her dress frozen stiff. Her eyes were locked on the wheel, not blinking, not responding, as if the jeers were river wind. They didn't know her name was Clara Halbrook. They didn't know she used to read engineering papers by candlelight while her husband slept beside her. They didn't know the creek behind her house had enough fall to turn slow water into a steady push. And they sure didn't know that her cabin, 200 feet up the slope, was the only one in the valley that hadn't burned a single log all winter. Because she hadn't told anyone, not when they delivered her firewood as a charity gesture in November, not when they dropped off stew and pity after the first storm of December. She took what was given with the hollow politeness of grief, then went back to the wheel. They didn't know what the wheel turned. They didn't know what the buried pipe carried. They didn't know the sound her stove made, because it made no sound at all, only warmth. That morning, when she straightened and walked past the ranch hands without speaking, she didn't notice, or maybe she did, that the frost on her coat was already melting. She was warm, they were not. But this story doesn't start there. It starts 10 months earlier, on the night she first figured it out. It was the tail end of March when the doctor told her he couldn't come. Snowdrifts had blocked the upper pass, and his wagon had overturned. She'd have to ride it out, he said. Clara, dizzy with fever, was barely able to lift the receiver to her ear. She had pleurisy. The cabin was cold, the fire nearly out, and her husband Paul had died 6 weeks before, struck by a falling beam while trying to patch the roof in a storm. She lay under quilts, shaking, lungs tight with every breath. The only sound was the wind pushing against the cabin's shutters and the irregular slap of river water down behind the barn. Her firewood stack was gone. All of it had gone into the stove. There was no one to fetch more. That night she believed she might die, and yet her eyes stayed open, staring at the frost creeping across the ceiling beams like it had a plan. Hours passed. Then, sometime just before dawn, she began to sweat, not because of the fever, but because the cold wasn't pressing in anymore. The room was warmer, not hot, but enough that the frost slowed its crawl, enough that her hands stopped stinging under the covers, enough to make her wonder if she was hallucinating. She crawled out of bed, dizzy and shivering, and padded barefoot to the wall. It was warm, not just near the stove, behind it, behind the chimney, near the floorboards along the west side. Even the clay mortar felt different, less brittle. By midday, the fire had gone out entirely. But the house wasn't freezing. The chimney bricks radiated warmth for hours, somehow longer than they ever had before. That night, the warmth stayed even after the last log burned down to dust. The next day, when the fever broke, Clara sat in a blanket and traced the wall warmth down to the floor, past the hearth and across the dirt beneath her trapdoor pantry, a place she'd never considered in engineering terms, a place she now stared at with new eyes. Something had changed. The idea hit her like a cough. The heat wasn't coming from the fire. The heat was coming from under the floor, from the ground itself. No, she told herself, that didn't make sense. Unless she pulled on boots, wrapped herself in every coat she had, and stepped into the snow. The creek ran behind her cabin, not frozen. Below the hill, it cut fast around the bend and widened into deeper flow. It never froze there, not fully, not in March, not even in the bad years. She stood on the slope, eyes narrowed. If the water could be pulled, channeled, diverted just slightly, it could flow beneath the house. She could raise the cabin floor slightly, root a trench through the earth, lay stone. The temperature exchange alone might. She stopped herself, shook her head. It was madness. And yet the cabin hadn't frozen, and yet she had nearly died, and yet she was alive now. She spent the next 3 months digging. April came, then May. She refused help when the town preacher sent boys to chop wood for her. "I'll be fine," she said. "Got a new method I'm working on." They smiled with the pity of men who had already written her off. "Just say the word if you need a man's help." Clara only nodded and went back to her trench. At first, She dug with a hand shovel, then with borrowed tools from the old mining shed by her late husband's still unfinished storage cellar. She used a leveler, some chalk, and her father's old French slide rule. She mapped the incline of the land and charted the water pressure. When the angle was right, she started dragging flat stone slabs from the hill and laying them in a half-moon curve under where the floor used to rest. She raised the cabin on jacks, a risky, dangerous task, and slid in a rock-lined channel beneath the hearth. It ran from the front of the cabin, underneath the main beams, then curled back out near the back wall, where it would rejoin the creek by way of a hidden outlet, a full loop. She didn't tell a soul. The water wheel came in August, an old cartwheel rim, salvaged from the preacher's broken wagon. She rebuilt it in secret with tin scoops, carved braces, and pine spokes. She mounted it on a vertical post, anchored by stone, with a gear rod that ran into the buried channel, and turned a simple impeller made of wagon tongue blades. Each turn pulled water, routed it beneath the floor in its stone trough, and let it return to the creek. That was all. No fire, no smoke, just motion, just heat transfer. By the end of September, she tested it, and it worked. The first night she slept with no fire. The cabin held at nearly 50 degrees. Not much, but enough. When the first freeze came in October, she added clay insulation between the rock and floor. A week later, she lined the entry channel with copper tubing she'd salvaged from a broken still. The warmth rose. By Thanksgiving, her cabin stayed at 62 degrees, without a single log. But the men didn't know that. They only saw the slow-turning wheel. They only saw her quiet eyes, the way she didn't join town meetings, the way she stood on her porch some mornings with no smoke rising from her chimney and no explanation. They laughed and whispered and wondered until the storm hit in January, and the firewood deliveries didn't make it past the pass, and one by one, chimneys in town went black when the logs ran out. Only one cabin stayed warm. Only one widow stepped outside with no frost on her door. And when the first family came knocking, their children shivering and their stove out of wood, Clara opened the door without a word and let them feel the warmth for themselves. The first family was the Turners. The youngest boy, Eli, had come down with a chill after falling through the river ice near town. They'd burned through 3 days' worth of wood in a single night, trying to keep him from seizing in his sleep. By the 4th morning, they were out. Nothing left but a splintered table and one half of a fence post. They wrapped the boy in blankets and made the long walk uphill, their boots crunching through brittle snow and their breath like smoke in the dawn air. They didn't expect her to open the door, but she did. Not just open it, she welcomed them in without hesitation. No sourness, no suspicion, just a quiet nod and a wave of her hand toward the old pine bench near the fireless hearth. The Turners expected cold inside, but it was warm, not blazing like a firelit room, but steady, stable, as if the whole place had been storing sunlight somehow, and was now leaking it out through the wood. Eli stopped shivering. His mother started crying. Clara didn't ask for thanks. She poured tea, let them sit, let the boys sleep. The Turners stayed one night, then another. Then she made up beds for the children in the pantry, and took the floor herself. By the end of the week, 3 more families had followed. The Brenners, who'd lost their woodpile in a flash flood when the creek jumped its banks. The Hendleys, whose chimney collapsed inward and sealed their stove under a ton of rubble. And the Frasers, who had plenty of wood but nothing dry enough to catch flame in the windstorm that had burst their windows out. All of them came for the same reason. They saw no smoke from her cabin, but no frost on her windows. The 4th night after the storm hit, Reverend Hollis made the climb himself, his thick black coat dusted with snow and his beard turned white as if winter had claimed him halfway up. He stepped into Clara's cabin without asking and stood for a long moment, turning slowly, his eyes catching on every corner. The room was full, 12 people total, including himself, children curled together beneath quilts. Old Mrs. Fraser's cough gone quiet. Reverend Hollis finally spoke. "There's no fire," he said, not quite a question. "But it's warm." Clara said nothing. "You haven't taken any of the wood the town sent." She shook her head. "And you're not using coal." "No," she said simply. He studied her. "Then how?" She hesitated, looked down at her hands, rough from work and river water. Then finally she said, "The creek runs year-round, steady, doesn't freeze past the bend. I just made use of it." Hollis frowned. "You mean that thing? That wheel? It turns the water through a channel, beneath the floor. There's stone and metal underneath that catches the transfer. It's nothing more than convection." "You made a stove out of the ground." "No stove," she said. "Just heat. Moved. Collected. Not fire. Just motion." The Reverend didn't understand the words. Not all of them. But he understood what he saw. Children alive. No smoke. No soot. No fire risk. "Could you build another?" Clara shook her head again. "Not easily. It took months. Wouldn't have finished it if the frost hadn't spared me last spring. I was supposed to die in March." He looked at her then, really looked at her. Not like a woman gone strange from grief, not like a project to mend, but like someone who'd seen further into the earth than the rest of them. "I'll say a word," he said softly, "about what you did." She gave him a weary smile. "Then I reckon they'll laugh louder than ever." But they didn't laugh, because the next morning, after he descended and told the others, 2 more families followed. And the day after that, 5 men climbed the hill not to mock but to study. Among them were Amos Rigg, who once called her ideas witch foolery, and Deputy Burl Nash, who never trusted a woman to do more than tend a fire. They came humble, they came cold, they came ready to ask. Clara didn't speak much, but she showed them what she could. The channel trench, the flow entry, the buried copper pipe that coiled beneath the central stone slab like a sleeping serpent, absorbing temperature difference from the stream and pressing it upward into the floor timbers. The rock acted like a thermal mass. The copper carried water heated not by fire, but by motion, the friction, the turbulence, the constant comparative flow of liquid warmer than the air. "It's not magic," she said, "and it ain't perfect, but it works, and it doesn't burn up anything except time and labor." Amos asked her how she knew it would work. She didn't tell him about the fever, or the days she hallucinated shapes in the frost and heard her dead husband whisper about gears turning under the soil. She only said, "I noticed something, then I measured it, and it kept me alive long enough to finish." Deputy Nash asked her if she feared the wheel would freeze one day. She shook her head. "It's shielded, and the flow's strong enough to resist most icing. I reinforced the intake with stone and left a trickle notch in case pressure builds. If it clogs, I'll know. Water sounds different when it's trapped." The men nodded like they understood. Maybe they did, but none of them had the hands she had, the thickened knuckles from lifting stone alone, the scars from frostbit mornings laying copper into earth. None of them had the months of silence to hear water differently. Still, they respected it, and for the first time, they stopped calling it lazy. Word spread, slowly at first, then faster when the storms kept coming. By mid-February, Clara's cabin was hosting rotating groups of townsfolk just to warm up for an hour or 2. They didn't ask questions anymore. They just sat and breathed and remembered what their lungs felt like when they weren't aching with cold. Mrs. Brenner began calling it the Miracle Hill. Others joked about the river stove. The Turners started bringing Clara bread without asking, and the Fraser children helped gather smooth stones from the creek to patch where erosion wore the trench lip thin. One child, a quiet boy named Thomas, stared long and hard at the wheel before asking, "Is it like a fire made of water?" Clara smiled. "Sort of." He came back every week after that. He watched, listened, asked questions that didn't sound like a child's. And in March, when the snows melted and the pass cleared and the supply wagons returned to town, Clara didn't rebuild her woodpile. She just oiled the wheel, reinforced the gear, teeth, checked the copper seal. Her fireless stove stayed warm through the melt, through the spring floods, through the early summer hail. And then one night in June, something shifted. The water slowed. It was subtle at first. The wheel turned just a little less fast. The sound of the creek was slightly off, less rushing, more muffled. Clara went to the intake, cleared debris. Nothing major, but the floor stayed cooler the next morning. She checked the flow outlet, still running, still rejoining the creek, but pressure was down. By the second day, the cabin was 10 degrees colder than normal. By the third, it was no better than the others in town. She didn't panic, but she sat on the porch longer than usual, hands folded, eyes narrowed toward the wheel like a doctor watching a patient relapse. Then she heard it, a tremor, not an earthquake, not a storm, a sound, low, pulsing from deeper than the creek. She stood, walked to the slope, listened again, and then it hit her. Upstream, not far, just past the bend where the creek narrowed. Something had changed upstream. She strapped on her boots, grabbed a spade, and started walking. She found the cause an hour later. A large pine had fallen during the last storm, not across the main flow, but over a minor side run that fed the left fork of the creek. That fork angled toward her intake. The blockage wasn't complete, but it slowed everything downstream, created turbulence that upset the balance. The wheel depended on a very specific rate of flow, not too much, not too little. The tree had shifted that rate just enough. Clara stood there, boots sunk in wet moss, staring at the pine like it was a thief in her house. She tried shifting it, but it was too heavy, waterlogged, half buried already in sediment. So she did what she always did. She went back, sharpened her saw, walked out again at dawn, and spent 3 days dismantling the tree, bit by bit, strip by strip. She cleared the channel with hands bleeding and shoulder torn, and when she was done, the creek sang like it used to. The wheel turned smooth, and her floor grew warm again. That summer, people stopped laughing entirely. In fact, they started building, not full systems. No one had the patience or skill, but modified versions, partial channels, warm rock boxes, underground underground ducts beneath sleeping lofts. Some copied her trench idea and used small garden wheels to push air through pipes buried near root cellars. Nothing matched hers, but the whole town got warmer, and the following winter, not a single chimney fire occurred. Not one child died of the cold, and every time someone asked her how she knew it would work, Clara just said, "I didn't, not for sure, but I had nothing else." That became the truth they remembered. Not the science, not the copper, or the wheel, just that she'd done something when no one else did, because she had to, because she wasn't lazy, because she had nothing else. By the following November, the water wheel had become more than just an oddity tucked into the hill. It had become a landmark. Even the surveyor from downstate asked about it when he passed through. He'd come to measure land deeds and settle a dispute between ranchers east of town. When he stopped at the general store, one of the Hendley boys pointed up toward the slope and said, "See that line of stone up near the tree line? That's the widow Halbrook's stove." The man frowned. Stove? They told him the story over a jug of cider, how she'd built it from creek flow and copper scrap, and how her chimney stayed cold through the worst storm in 20 years. He laughed at first, a low bureaucrat's chuckle, like the notion was cute. Then he saw the place for himself on his way out, and stood silently by the wheel, watching it spin slow and steady in the frost-thick morning. Clara was inside. He didn't knock, just stood there a while, nodding to himself before walking on without another word. That was the sort of thing that happened now. People didn't ask questions so much as they observed. They didn't offer help. They brought things, tin scraps, sheet metal, buckets of riverstone. No one dared say, "Thank you," but the gifts piled up in silence. And Clara, always the same, just nodded and kept the wheel turning. But something else had begun. It started with Thomas, the boy who'd called it a fire made of water. He was 10 now, thin as a rail, the kind of child who didn't run like the others, but stared instead, watched, measured. He began drawing in charcoal, rough sketches of gears, ducts, chambers. He once spent an entire Sunday digging a channel behind the schoolhouse until his teacher dragged him home by the ear. When asked why, he only said, "It's warmer if the trench faces south." By late winter, he had recreated a crude version of Clara's channel under his own family's porch, using tin cans, copper wire, and a broken bellows he'd scavenged. It didn't heat much, but it worked. You could feel it, barely, but real. Word of that spread faster than any adult's invention might have. Because now it wasn't just a widow doing strange things. It was a child, emulating her. Clara didn't encourage him, but she didn't stop him either. She let him come, let him sketch, let him sit on her porch and trace the wheel's rhythm in the dirt with a stick. She saw something of herself in the boy, and she was afraid of it. There's a loneliness in inventing things, not the good kind of solitude, the peace of quiet labor, but a kind of exile that deepens every time someone asks you why you don't just do things the normal way. That's how it had been for Clara even before Paul died. He'd supported her tinkering, sure, let her fill half the cellar with salvaged copper and oil cans and books about French furnaces and Roman aqueducts, but there was always a quiet wall between them, some limit to how far she could go before he shook his head and said, "That's enough for today, hun." Then he was gone, and there was no one to stop her. No one to say, "That's not what a woman does." No one to tell her that warmth came from fire and nothing else. But now Thomas was watching, and she felt the weight of being seen. It changed something. She began to explain things aloud when he was near. How the copper wasn't for heat conduction alone, but for regulation. How the water pressure varied based on the season. How stone retained thermal mass, but also acted as a buffer. And how the placement of the intake gate mattered more than the diameter of the wheel. She never raised her voice, never told him what to do, but Thomas learned, and others noticed. The real shift began after the second thaw of that year. A pair of ranchers, Wes Clary and Will Donegan, had been trying to build a heated barn for calving season. They'd burned through 2 whole cords of pine in just 8 days, and still lost 5 calves to exposure. When they heard what Thomas had done under his porch, they didn't go to the boy, they came to Clara. "Could we?" Will began awkwardly, hat in hand. "Could we see how you place the stones?" Clara looked up from her wheel, eyes steady. "You'll need a trench, 3 feet deep, 6 feet wide, sloped just enough for flow. The bigger mistake is not how much water you use, it's how slow it cools. You'll need insulation." Wes frowned. "Insulation?" "Hey, clay, ash, anything that slows the bleed. Otherwise you're just building a pipe to nowhere." They nodded, scribbled notes, thanked her more with their boots than their mouths. 2 weeks later, their barn was the only one in the valley where no calf died during the last frost. Then it spread. More men came, some with questions, some with blueprints, some with hands blistered from trying to recreate her system, and failing. A few scoffed. Too much work. Others asked to buy it. She said no, not out of pride, not out of secrecy, but because it wasn't something to sell. It's not a thing, she told one merchant from Abilene. It's a process, a rhythm, a way of using what's already there. The merchant offered $60. She sent him home with frostbite. By the time the following winter approached, the town had changed. There was still firewood, of course, still smoke in the air, but the fear was different now. Men didn't talk about the cold like a punishment from God. They talked about insulation, about thermal retention, about flow regulation. They used words they barely understood but believed in anyway, and Clara's cabin became something like a church. She didn't want it to, but every Sunday, folks began walking the path to her porch, not to pray, but to sit, to ask, to listen. Sometimes she spoke, sometimes she just handed out scraps of tin and said, "Try this." It was Thomas who built the second working system. He dug for a month, bent pipe, with his uncle's forge. His parents helped, though they didn't understand half of it. When it was done, their pantry stayed 15 degrees warmer than the rest of the house. He didn't gloat. He just wrote it all down in a notebook and started sketching the next version. And for the first time in the town's history, the men built under a woman's instruction. She sketched on feed paper, measured inclines with a carpenter's level and a homemade brass gauge, directed volunteers with flags and rope lines and chalk. It took 3 weeks to finish the schoolhouse system. The intake came from a narrow sluice above the eastern bluff. The trench was 2 feet deeper than hers, lined with alternating stone and cast iron ribs salvaged from an old collapsed bridge. The outflow rejoined the creek downstream in a calm bend where children now came to watch the steam lift faintly in the morning. The first time they lit no fire and the room still held warmth, the teacher wept. No child would burn their hand again, not there. And Clara, she didn't celebrate. She went home, sat on her porch, watched the wheel. It turned slow, steady, faithful, like it always had, like it always would. But not everything stays steady. One day, the wheel stopped. It didn't make a sound when it stopped. That was the first sign something was wrong. Clara had grown so used to its rhythm, so attuned to the constant creak and splash of its motion, that when she stepped out one morning and heard nothing, her heart clenched without needing to look. The wheel stood still in the frost, as if frozen in time. Water still flowed beneath it, sluggish but unbroken. The blades were clean. No ice, no debris. The axle was intact, but the whole system had fallen into a kind of mute refusal to move. She didn't panic. She didn't curse. She knelt in the cold earth and pressed her fingers to the central post, feeling not the usual faint vibration, but a stillness that went deeper than silence. It was absence, as though something invisible had snapped. She went to work, stripped the braces, unhooked the stabilizing wire, inspected the shaft housing. Nothing cracked, no signs of warping or settling. The water's level had dipped slightly, but that wasn't enough to cause this. Still, she tore down the outer frame, rebuilt the lower paddles, adjusted the pitch of the entry gate. She rebalanced the whole thing by lantern light, her knuckles bleeding in the snowmelt, until the wheel groaned back into motion. But it was weak, jerky, and worst of all, it didn't hold. By evening, it had stopped again. The next day, she hiked 3 miles upstream. It had been years since she climbed the ridge north of the inlet, years since Paul had shown her where the water forked into a hidden run behind the aspen grove, where it slipped underground for nearly half a mile before emerging near the southern channel. The forest felt wrong now, too quiet. The air had a tension to it, like it was listening. Then she saw it. The beavers. A new dam had formed in the fork above the upper run. It wasn't large, but it was enough. The diverted flow was sapping her intake stream dry, rerouting it toward a deeper gulch to the east. She watched from the undergrowth as the creatures moved, efficient, methodical, tireless. And why wouldn't they be? This was what they were born to do. They had no concept of cabins or warmth or children shivering in schools. They only knew water, wood, and the will to survive. Clara didn't move for a long time. She knew what it would take to remove it. Dynamite would be fastest, but dangerous. Manual disassembly would take days, maybe weeks, and they'd build again, unless she stared at the ground, felt the water under her feet, thought of motion, of pressure. Then she returned home, opened her cellar, and brought up the old iron pipe lengths Paul had tried to use for the never-finished root cellar drainage project. It was time to build a bypass. She worked through the next 3 nights, trenching with her pick through half-frozen ground, laying the iron by feel more than light. Her hands turned raw again, her back screamed. But she remembered the fever in March, the cold pressing in like a tomb. She couldn't let that happen again. At one point, Thomas came. He didn't speak, just picked up a spade and started digging beside her, wordlessly, for hours. When she paused, he kept going. Finally, she said, "You should be home." He said, "You shouldn't be doing this alone." That was all. By sunrise of the 4th day, the bypass was complete. The wheel never stopped again, not in the way it had before. It groaned sometimes in the heart of winter, or slowed when the leaves choked the creek mouth, or whined faintly on dry days in summer. But it never failed, never again. It had become too much a part of the land to be separated now. The children who'd once been told to stay away from the old widow's mad contraption now played around it, splashing in the overflow, counting the turns of the paddles like some sacred clock. The stones that held the channel had grown mossy with time, roots creeping around their base like fingers, learning to trust what once had been alien. The town changed with it, not all at once, not like a flood, more like a slow, permanent thaw. By the second winter after the fire, no new stoves had been installed in the rebuilt schoolhouse. The mayor's office had one small iron stove for appearances, but it hadn't been used in nearly a year. 3 new homes on the northern slope were built with buried flow channels right into their plans, not as additions, but foundations. People didn't talk about it much anymore, because it wasn't a miracle now. It was normal. That's how deep the shift had sunk. Deep enough that something which once drew mockery and then reverence had finally become routine. And yet in the silence beneath that acceptance, Clara Holbrook felt something approaching grief, not for herself, but for what had almost happened. She kept the wheel maintained with the same precision she'd used in the early days, woke before the light hit the western slope, checked the torque, the brace seams, the sediment catch. She oiled the rod housing every 3 days, whether it squeaked or not. The impeller, her first and only, had lost 2 blades over time, and she replaced them with hand-cut pine, carved in silence by her own stovelight. No one asked her to do it. No one paid her. She just did. It was part of her, like breathing, like survival. But as the months stretched toward the 3rd year since the first freeze that had nearly killed her, she noticed something that disturbed her more than any break in the wheel. The town was growing too fast. A new family arrived nearly every week now. People from neighboring counties, even some from the edge of Kansas, lured by word of the town that stayed warm without smoke. They brought their own ideas, their own ambitions. Some wanted to build machines, not wheels. Some wanted to patent designs inspired by the widow's system. Some didn't even believe the original story. She probably had a stove hidden in the floor, one man sneered at the general store. No way water alone can keep you warm in January. Another said, her husband must have built the original system. These women like to take credit once the man's dead. They hadn't seen the frost on the ceiling beams. They hadn't felt the warmth when the last log burned out. They hadn't dug the trench by hand in the black of March. But that didn't stop them from speaking. Clara didn't argue. She'd done all her arguing already, with stone and copper and soil and blood. There was nothing left to say to those kinds of men. But she did worry, because Thomas was growing up now, and they were looking at him. He'd finished his first full system the year prior, 2 miles south, for a widow and her 3 daughters who had lost everything in a barn fire. He'd built it alone, save for a few boys who helped carry stone. And it worked. Better than hers in some ways. Smaller wheel, more efficient channel flow, and a system of vents beneath the floor that regulated pressure automatically. He was proud, but he was also noticed. A man from Chicago rode in on a black mare, dressed too fine for dust. He offered Thomas a place at an academy. Real engineering, he said, not digging with sticks and law. Thomas came to Clara that night, letter in hand, torn. What do I do? She stared into the hearthless warmth of her cabin, that gentle hum beneath the floor, as soft and constant as breath. You already know. He looked down. But if I go, they might turn it into something else. They will, she said. Eventually. Then what's the point? She turned to him. The point is, someone has to remember the first wheel, what it felt like, what it sounded like when it stopped. You don't have to fight them, but don't forget. He nodded slowly. He didn't say whether he'd go. She didn't ask again. That spring the creek flooded. It had always flooded, every decade or so. But this one was heavier, faster, meaner than any before. The snows in the high country melted too fast. The mountain lakes spilled. Trees went down like matchsticks, their roots torn from soaked cliffsides. The water wheel was in the path. She heard it coming before she saw it. This unnatural roar, not like water but like wrath. A sound too wide, too deep. A sound that said, I'm taking it all. She ran, not to escape, but to protect. She reached the wheel just as the first crest broke the bend. The intake was already choked with debris. The brace wires snapped in sequence, one after the other, like tendons giving way. The paddles cracked. The shaft spun loose, wild and free and doomed. She grabbed the emergency release pin, a final measure she'd never had to use, and yanked it out with both hands. The wheel jumped the axle, spun madly once, twice, and then lifted clear as the river took it. She watched it go, her creation, her savior, her shame and her glory, spinning downstream into the chaos, paddles shattered, frame twisting like a prayer being pulled apart mid-sentence, and she fell to her knees in the mud, not crying, just empty. The cabin didn't freeze that night. Enough heat had stored in the stone, in the copper, in the floorboards soaked with years of motion, but it cooled, noticeably, and for the first time in a long time, Clara sat inside, wrapped in blankets, waiting for the sound of children on her porch, and instead hearing only the silence of a dead wheel. The next morning, Thomas arrived. His coat was soaked. He hadn't waited for dawn. He'd heard. Somehow he always knew. He said nothing, just stood in the doorway and looked at the broken gear shaft leaning against her table. "I didn't think it could be destroyed," he whispered. "It wasn't destroyed," she said. "It was taken, and taking is what the world does when you make something good." He looked at her. "Will you build it again?" She shook her head. "My hands aren't what they used to be. My back won't take another trench. But you—" She reached out and pressed her hand against his chest. "You already have." The town gathered that week, not to mourn the wheel, but to honor it. They brought stones, not for a grave, for a pedestal. The children painted the paddles they recovered from the river, each one with names of those who had been warmed by it. Dozens, maybe more. Clara didn't speak at the gathering, but when the crowd parted and she stood alone before the stone base, she reached into her coat and placed something at its foot. Her father's slide rule, the one that had measured the angle of the intake on a fevered morning in March, when her breath came in gasps and the cold had nearly won. She left it there, then walked home. Years passed. The town changed again. More houses, fewer stoves. A small plaque at the old schoolhouse read, "No fire ever lit this room, but no child here has ever shivered." Thomas left for a while, learned things, built things, but he always returned. And each time he brought back something strange. Scraps of machines reimagined through Clara's principles. Not factory devices, not blueprints, but experiences. In time, he built a school of his own, not of stone or wood, but of motion, where boys and girls learned to hear the creak before they measured it, to feel heat in their bones before they tried to trap it in metal. And above the door, in tiny letters carved by his own hand, were the words, "We turn what others burn." Clara died in her sleep on a mild spring morning. No one knew exactly when. Thomas found her, wrapped in the same coat she'd worn during that first freeze, her fingers curled around a scrap of copper, as if she'd been dreaming of a new system. They didn't bury her right away. They sat with her for 3 days, not out of grief alone, but respect. Because you don't rush the turning of a wheel. You wait, you breathe, you warm, and still, to this day, if you walk the ridge above the bend, where the creek curves slow and gentle through stone and moss, you might see a shimmer beneath the surface. Not a fire, not a machine, but a trace of motion, endless, faithful, turning always beneath the world's forgetting, just like she did.